Prime Minister, dear Mr. Gayford, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, it is always a momentous event in the life of this institution when we have the pleasure of welcoming a head of government. And the pleasure is all the greater and the event all the more momentous when the head of government has traveled far and long to come to us. And so I would like to thank you very, very warmly, Prime Minister, on behalf of our entire institution, for paying us this visit today on this, your first official trip to France as Prime Minister of New Zealand. It is a wonderful, wonderful moment for us, having you here with us, and a great honor to welcome you. To what do we owe this honor? Of course, one might say that it's because Sciences Po has had the pleasure of training in the course of time 6 of the last 7 French presidents. You had a meeting this morning with Emmanuel Macron, and he made clear that he was an alumnus of Sciences Po, I believe, in your conversation. That may be one reason for you to come to us. But I believe that you're also aware that Sciences Po is fortunate in having nearly half of its student population that's comprised of international students coming from all parts of the planet. A few of them are actually here from New Zealand today. If they're anywhere in this room, they might as well stand and clap so that we can see them, but they might be too discreet. Any New Zealanders? Yes. You've come to Sciences Po, Prime Minister, to discuss the challenge of climate change. You made it clear in our previous conversation that you'd be willing to answer any questions on any other topics in the course of your conversation with our students, but the focus of your speech is going to be the position of New Zealand and your own personal position on the global fight against climate change. It so happens that Sciences Po too is very concerned about the issue of climate change. How could we not be? And we're happy to be one of the places that are particularly active in the public debate on climate change, so much so that a few years back, prior to COP21 and to the Paris Agreement, we set up here at Sciences Po a full-scale enactment of the negotiation to come, which we think might have been one of the keys to the success of the negotiation that Laurence Toubiana was such a key player in, and that led to the Paris Agreement of December 2015. That agreement, of course, was to us all a moment of euphoria. It was at least a glimmer of hope in the midst of particularly dark events in France and in the rest of the world at the time. But then, of course, came the uncertainties arising from Brexit, the US elections, and so much else that has happened since the end of 2015. As is sometimes, if not always, the case, hope has sprung up again in the guise of youth. In November 2015, Justin Trudeau, whom we shall all be seeing later on this afternoon here at Sciences Po, and whom we all thought at the time was extraordinarily young, was elected, I should say, Prime Minister of Canada at the age of 43. A year and a half later, in May of 2017, Emmanuel Macron became the President of France at what we then thought was the extraordinarily young age of 39. But lo and behold, a few months later, in October 2017, you, Ms. Adern, became Prime Minister of New Zealand at the truly young age of 37. Now, of course, for any university, a visit from such a young figure in a position of such great responsibility is a tremendous opportunity. Because to educate our students, we, of course, provide them with the theoretical learning which they will need in their lives to come, in the responsibilities they will assume in due course. But we ensure that theory is backed up with practical experience, which they will be able to draw on in their lives to come. And we also take care to present them with role models that will inspire their actions and the values which they will have to defend in their lives to come. With your enthusiasm, your talent, and your youth, You fit the bill admirably, Prime Minister, and this is another reason why we're so happy to have you with us. Now, for the Frenchman that I am, and for many of my fellow citizens, for many Europeans and other foreign students, New Zealand is in many ways a fascinating country. Of course, it is a distant land, which some of us know little about, even though I hasten to add that we have 3 very active partnerships with New Zealand here at Sciences Po, with what are probably the 3 biggest universities in your country, the University of Auckland, Victoria University of Wellington, and the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. And for all 3 universities, we see year after year that there are more students from Sciences Po wanting to go to those universities than there are positions available in these universities. New Zealand may seem to be a fairly modestly sized country. It is the 74th in the world in terms of surface area, the 120th in terms of population size, but it has a very healthy economy, around 20th in terms of GDP per capita. And above all, and perhaps most importantly in the context of today's conference, New Zealand places high in many so-called qualitative rankings, such as the UN Human Development Agenda and Development Index, and many NGO rankings on civil liberties, corruption levels, pacifism, or environmental performance. New Zealand often sits with the Scandinavian countries or Iceland in these rankings, and at a time when we keep hearing that our states should become big or great again, it is, I think, refreshing to us all that realize that those happiest states may not be the biggest of them all after all. The fact that you're the leader of a country that stands out for such great reasons, of course, makes us all the more fortunate to have you here. And speaking of standing out for great reasons, perhaps there are also some rugby tips that you'd like to share with us, because we might be able to pass them on to our national team. There is perhaps another reason why I'm particularly pleased to have you with us today. I spoke of the role model that your talent, your youth, and your responsibilities make you. There's another area in which you're a role model, at least so I was told, and I hope that this was not in jest. It's the DJing at which you excel. But maybe you'd like to tell us a little more about that in a moment. At Sciences Po, we attach great importance to artistic performance. And your success shows that political, or more broadly, professional success and artistic passion are not contradictory. In fact, the two seem to merge and marry very well. Of course, the last reason, Prime Minister, for which you are a symbol and an admirable example for our students, women students especially, is a visible and well-known fact, a fact that you chose to make public in due course, but fairly early on. It is, of course, the way that you're reconciling pregnancy and the leadership of your country. You said during the election campaign, when in fact you were not pregnant, or at least not officially pregnant, that no one today should question a woman about her baby plans before offering her a position, whatever that position may be. It's one thing to think that. It is another brave thing to say it, and it is still more eloquent to live it and to prove to women the world over that whatever their choice is about having a family, no one, neither other people nor themselves, should perceive those choices as an obstacle to their career. We make this point day after day in many different ways to our students, but for them to see it with their own eyes is probably 1,000 times more effective and meaningful for them. For all these reasons, 1,000 thanks again for being with us today. Thank you to PSIA, the Paris School of International Affairs, for organizing this event. Thank you very much to Laurence Toubiana for having been instrumental in bringing this visit about and in moderating the discussions. The floor is now yours, Prime Minister. Thank you so very much. Again, great conference.
Bonjour. Bonjour, and if I could greet you as I would in New Zealand, kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. And can I give a special acknowledgement to the New Zealanders in the room as well, and as is truly the New Zealand way, I do know one of them already. I feel incredibly humbled and proud to be here today. I also feel hopeful. Humbled because I come from a small country, thousands of miles away, and we are a self-deprecating people. We're quick to downplay our relative importance, but in spite of that, one that has never been afraid to use our voice. And that's why I also feel proud. It may not seem obvious, but in New Zealand, the generations before me were defined and shaped by the debate on Vietnam, the politics of sport and apartheid, and the nuclear-free movement. But my generation will be defined and shaped by climate change. And when thinking about how this generation will react and how we will collectively respond, I feel hopeful. I should add that I haven't always felt that way. In 2008, I ran for Parliament for the very first time. I was 28 years old. The seat I was contesting was in the rural Waikato. It's a place that I grew up, and one that is centred around our agricultural community. A public meeting was held a few weeks before the election in the heart of the seat. And as one of only a few meetings, it was incredibly well attended. Now, I brought my grandmother and my mother as moral support and took position with the other candidates at the front of the hall for speeches and a question and answer session. Near the end of the evening, I was asked two especially controversial questions, one on environmental regulation, the other on climate change. I answered both of them matter-of-factly, but also shared my view around the need for decisive action on global warming. The response I received was somewhat unexpected. It started with a slow murmur, then an audible groan, and then a full-blown boo washed across the audience. I have often joked since that time that my grandmother was probably amongst those who booed me that evening. I remain absolutely certain of it to this day. I entered Parliament that same year, but as an opposition member of Parliament, with my party losing that election after 9 years in office. And I distinctly remember sitting in the debating chamber and watching from the back benches as legislation that brought in our emissions trading scheme was eroded, and as a committee of Parliament was established to question climate change. It felt to me like we were slowly but surely sliding backwards. Now, that was just 10 years ago. Now, there are many things about where we are now that I wouldn't have predicted. Me being Prime Minister was one, me being heavily pregnant at the time is another. Another is that we have moved both our national but also our global response to climate change to the place that we have. There is reason for hope, and you and your country have sat at the centre of why. On the 12th of December 2015, it was late in New Zealand where the decision to limit temperature rises was beamed out beyond Paris. It was the cause of much celebration. Seeing the Eiffel Tower lit up with messages supporting this work lifted people's spirits around the world that night. It is truly historic that 196 countries could agree to take this action on climate change. But I'm sure every one of the nations present there that day had both their own domestic situations to consider and their own motivations. My party wasn't the one that signed up to the Paris Agreement, but we have heartily supported it. And I can tell you what is now driving us as a coalition government to fulfil these obligations. The first motivation is where we are. We are a Pacific nation. We have an extensive coastline and most of our major cities are on the coast. One recent estimate from our Ministry of Environment suggests that $19 billion of assets are at risk from sea level rise and flooding events, including 5 airports, 50 kilometres of rail, 2,000 kilometres of road and 40,000 homes. Not only that, but large portions of our economy are linked to our agricultural, horticultural and tourism businesses, all of which are particularly sensitive to extreme weather events. Estimates for the cost of weather events to New Zealand's land transport network alone have increased in the last 10 years from $20 million a year to over $90 million annually. But I'm mindful that weather events that have struck us in recent times have struck somewhere else first, and with devastating consequences. I saw this for myself on a recent visit to the island nations of Samoa, Tonga, Niue, and the Cook Islands. 2 of these island nations had recently endured a cyclone that had affected homes, schools, the electricity network, even the parliament buildings were destroyed in Tonga. But even before Cyclone Gita, if I was to pick one issue that has been a consistent theme in the Pacific in recent years, it has been climate change. I know you too have a strong connection with the Pacific, with your own territories. Collectively, these islands represent a tiny portion of global emissions. They play almost no role in creating the crisis we now face, but they are already the first to face its devastating impacts. In Tonga, I visited a primary school which had a few weeks earlier been ripped apart by the country's worst storm in decades. The children were taking classes in tents provided by UNICEF, surrounded by the battered buildings that used to be their classrooms. The courage and resilience of those children left a mark on me. I was led by officials to see the state of the buildings post the cyclone, only to find, after walking across a muddied field, that a child had followed me. She was standing outside one of the buildings that had no roof or internal walls. Through a translator, she told me it was her classroom. She showed me where she used to sit and pointed to the posters and drawings that were tattered and shredded around the room. It was the work that her class had produced, and a shattering reminder of the extreme weather that now rages through these countries on a much more regular basis. But it's not only storms that threaten Pacific nations. There is already saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies. Staple crops like taro have been devastated in some areas near the coast due to saltwater intrusion. And more importantly, some aquifers are at risk of becoming salty. On top of this, increasing ocean acidification is driven by carbon dioxide absorbed into the oceans, changing the chemistry of the seawater. Warmer and more acidic oceans threaten to deprive communities of the tuna, reef fish and other marine life, which for some represent their main source of protein and their only reliable natural resource. Now, all of this could just point simply to adaptation and a change perhaps in lifestyle, not in low-lying Kiribati or Tuvalu. They're the oceans that have sustained local communities for thousands of years, and they are the same oceans that will soon rise to swallow them up forever. Across the Pacific, already 8 low-lying islands have been immersed by rising sea levels. While globally the increase is around 3 millimetres a year, it is more like 12 millimetres per year in the Western Pacific Ocean, an effect of the trade winds. For the Pacific, climate change is not a hypothetical. It is real, and it is happening now. It is no wonder then that there has been some debate around the issue of refugee visas, specifically for climate change. But I'd argue that this discussion must first recognise the desire of people to stay, to remain on their land and in their homes, nurturing their culture. We know and understand this. New Zealand does not simply sit in the Pacific, we are the Pacific too. and we are doing our best to stand with our family as they face these threats. That is why we're working in partnership with our Pacific neighbours on various aid and research projects. We're active in disaster relief, but also building resilience. For example, New Zealand has a track record of supporting the installation of successful new renewable energy supplies in Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands and Niue. These help not only in reducing the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but they free up much needed money that would otherwise be spent on expensive diesel stocks to run generators. We've also joined the Pacific Islands Partnership on Ocean Acidification with the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Programme. The Pacific Islands Partnership is providing important research to better understand the long-term impacts of ocean acidification and the risks it presents for Pacific Island nations' fishing resources. But all of this tells you a bit about where we are geographically, but it doesn't tell you much about who we are. And that ingredient is just as important in the way that we view our global challenges. Now, of course, there are things that you might already know about us, like the prevalence of certain animals in New Zealand. That goes some way to explaining why agriculture was the single biggest contributor to New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, something that makes us unique. You probably know we are small. In fact, we make up 0.17% of global emissions. You might also know that we are sports mad. You raised rugby first, not me. Especially rugby league and rugby union, played, I should add, by both men and women, and quite successfully. But none of that tells you about our culture or our character. New Zealand has a proud record of independence and world-leading reforms. In 1893, our women became the first in the world to win the right to vote. In the decades that followed, we were among the world's first countries to introduce the key foundations of a modern welfare state: universal pensions, healthcare, and education. We were at the table when the United Nations was born, and we have always stood up for rules-based multilateral action, whether in the battle against commercial whaling, ensuring consistent and fair trade rules, or standing up against nuclear weapons and testing. But on the environment, our approach is probably best summed up by one Māori word: kaisiakitanga. It means guardianship. And I would like to think it underpins the motivation for taking the decisions we need to for the next generation. But whether your motivation is a moral one or an economic one, both stack up. Around the world, we see oil companies investing billions of dollars in clean energy. Companies are investing in charging stations for electric vehicles. Oil companies themselves are looking to the future, and that includes renewables. We all know we are going to have to do things differently. Norwegian-based energy company Statoil has developed its own climate roadmap in support of the Paris Climate Agreement and includes, by 2020, putting 25% of its research funding into developing new energy and energy efficiency solutions and making decisions that support a low-carbon future. Oil giant Shell was even writing reports in 1988 predicting the impact of climate change. They followed that up a little while later, just this week, saying they strongly support the Paris Agreement and the need for society to transition to a lower carbon future. I completely agree. So in New Zealand, we have also started taking action. Now, we are a unique government, formed in October last year with the New Zealand Labour Party, of which I am the leader, our coalition partner, New Zealand First, and our confidence and supply partner, the Green Party. We are united on many issues, and the environment is one of them. Our climate change work is led by Green Party co-leader and our Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw. But collectively, we have all committed to the goal of becoming a carbon neutral economy by 2050. We have committed to making our electricity system 100% renewable by 2035. Right now, we are preparing to consult with the New Zealand public on legislation to help us reach zero carbon, and that will become law next year. The process in getting there will be inclusive and transparent, with input from non-government organisations, businesses, communities, and ordinary New Zealanders. We're also setting up an independent climate commission of experts who will develop carbon budgets right through to 2050. That means they'll set the amount of carbon we can afford to put into the atmosphere each year to get us to carbon neutrality, while ensuring we have enough energy available to run our economy and our country. As part of our regional development work and under the leadership of the New Zealand First Minister, Shane Jones, we've started a program to plant 1 billion trees in the next 10 years. This will contribute to reducing CO2 emissions, both through CO2 absorption and by reducing erosion. To tackle the biggest contributor of our emissions profile, New Zealand has led a global research alliance of 49 nations, including France, that is working to identify technologies that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions generated from agriculture. It's our intention to help lead the world to low emission but highly productive agriculture and food production. But this is not the only industry undergoing transformation. Astoundingly, governments currently spend more than $400 billion each year on lowering the price of oil, gas, and coal. This is an enormous impediment to our efforts. Reducing these subsidies would help cut emission. And that's why at the Paris Climate Conference we launched a communique on fossil fuel subsidy reform that was endorsed by 40 governments. France was one of the first to sign on and has, of course, taken a leadership role in the role of oil and gas exploration generally. In New Zealand, our sense of responsibility to those whose livelihood is based around the production of fossil fuels means we too have started planning for the future. Several weeks ago, we injected $20 million into one of our oil and gas producing regions to explore a range of alternative economic development opportunities. And because of the need to ensure a just transition around fossil fuels, just last week we also announced that we will no longer be granting any new offshore oil and gas exploration permits. We are making this decision now because we cannot ignore the inevitable. No doubt it would have been politically easier to leave this call to someone else. But I refuse to stand by and watch as communities who have economies that rely on these industries without certainty and a plan for what the next 20 or 30 years will look like. And this brings me to the final point. For all of the fear that surrounds this issue, I come back to that feeling I expressed at the start, and it is one of hope. This is a chance to transform our respective economies, to face our collective future with knowledge, to grow the job opportunities and the health and well-being of our communities as we go, to put people and the need to preserve our environment for the next generation right at the centre of what we do. You are already playing a leadership role, and I would like to believe that as a small island nation embedded in the Pacific, we are too. But our action alone will not be enough. Collectively, we must call to action not only other governments, but civic society, business, and the public. Wherever we are, whatever our motivations or our roles, I hope each of us can look back on this period of time and say that we were on the right side of history, that we were humbled in the wake of the science, that we were proud of what others before us made possible, and that we were hopeful in taking on this challenge, and most of all, that we were guardians for the next generation. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Dear Prime Minister, when I prepared the negotiation for the Paris Agreement, and the last night, the idea was to have a very ambitious goal. And this ambition goal was about achieving carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. And that was a big win of the Paris Agreement. Then after 2015, we had some bad news. Decision of US to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Some good news as well, that part of the American society said we are still in. But the big, very good news was your election. Because you, as soon as you arrived in your office, you said that your country would be carbon neutral by 2050. And that was one of the first government. We are a very small group of government saying we will achieve Paris Agreement, the full goal, without waiting others. We will be the avant-garde. And in 2017, Prime Minister, you accepted our proposition to lead a coalition of progressive countries calling for this carbon neutrality by 2050. And you are, again, in the leading seat. Islands always have driven the climate negotiation for a very good reason. But it's even more important and surprising for a country that has such big challenges. And my question to you, and again my thanks to you first, because of your leading role, but my question is how you envisage, how you would in a way tie all these conflicting interests together in a country, in a small island, who is so, of course, exposed to climate change, but with the challenge of transforming your economy so high. So I would appreciate your first response, and then ask the students who certainly want to ask you many questions to line up to the two mics, and then Prime Minister will respond to you 3 by 3. So please line up while Prime Minister maybe launch that discussion, that debate.
And hopefully this headset is working, and it is. And please, by all means, do not feel constrained in any questions you wish to ask. I'm happy to answer anything that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be climate related. It can even be related to just a general attempt to have an existence in a political field. On the question of how do you draw in all of these competing interests, I think one of the things that I think is most telling, which perhaps wasn't acknowledged as much at the time, is that with the coalition government we have, represented by 3 different parties, there was still total agreement that we had to work collaboratively to address the challenge of climate change. And the fact that on each of the milestones we've introduced since that time, they've had the support of all of those 3 different parties. Now, in part, that's been an acknowledgement by each of us that there is an inevitability to what we're facing. And we can either take an approach that allows a jarring shock to our local economies, a la mining in the UK, or we can plan ahead. And so even a party that is very strongly representative of the regions in New Zealand has acknowledged that. How do we then bring in those competing interests within New Zealand society, and particularly our food producers? It's to turn climate change from a risk and a challenge into an opportunity. New Zealand is already perceived to be clean and green. Now we must be seen as clean, green and carbon neutral. And there is a real challenge faced by countries who have a profile that mirrors ours, where agriculture is very high, who are looking for the research, development and the technology to meet those demands. I see us as having the chance to really be at the fore of that, and to demonstrate to the world that our product is unique, because of the fact that we are a low emissions food producer, and consumers who have a conscience in the way that they purchase may differentiate us on that basis. So it's really about turning the fear into an economic opportunity.
A wonderful lesson even for our French agriculture. I can tell it's not that easy to develop, so we will look at what you will be doing. Maybe you can just go first.
Hi.
Trust the Kiwi to get in first.
Hi. My question is about some of the other reforms that the Labour government are doing, because I know there's a lot of exciting reforms in justice and human rights that you're looking at as well, and I wondered if you could talk about that. And also, I bought you a baby present.
Oh, that's so kind.
I'll give this to you afterwards.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind. Thank you. You know, I think probably when it comes to human rights, it's been a source of great pride for consecutive Labour governments in particular. We championed, even though these were the subject of conscience votes in New Zealand, we really championed issues like civil unions, marriage equality, homosexual law reform, prostitution reform, and marriage equality. All of these have been challenging debates, but we've always been willing to stand at the front of those progressive agendas. But you mentioned criminal justice. I'd say this is one of the challenges probably a lot of people wouldn't know that New Zealand faces, that we have a crime rate that has been declining and is now currently plateauing, but in complete contradiction to that, we have a growing prison population. We have one of the highest imprisonment rates relative to other countries, relative to, second only really to the United States and the world. And most people wouldn't know that about us. And if we continue on the current trajectory we are, we'll be building a new prison every 2 to 3 years. Now, when we came in, we said we didn't want to build more prisons. We wanted to build more schools. We wanted to build more early education centres. But that doesn't change the political reality of staring down the fact that even if we make changes in the future, right now we have a population that outstrips our capacity. So that's something that we're facing now. And what we've said first and foremost is we want to have a conversation with the public around what we do. Because you hear New Zealanders say we don't want more prisons, but the moment there is a human tragedy caused by some horrific criminal act, people immediately revert to seeking the kind of response in our criminal justice system that's contrary to that and leads to prison growth. So we're trying to lay the foundation for that conversation in New Zealand because ultimately we need to reconcile that prison population and our crime rate, and right now we haven't.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Because we don't have that much time, I suggest we take 3 questions and then you try to...
And I'll be quicker.
Yeah, go on, please.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, Mrs. Prime Minister. I have a question about Indigenous people in New Zealand. I noticed that you were speaking in an Indigenous language, and I know that you've focused really hard on trying to incorporate Indigenous people into New Zealand more and more. How have you been working specifically with Indigenous groups on the issue of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you. You?
Dear Prime Minister, some countries, some island nation states might disappear because of the rise of sea level, and how do you think the international community should react to that so that they don't disappear? Thank you.
Thank you. Frederick?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for the enlightening speech that really gives hope to the climate change movement. My question is kind of following up on that. How is New Zealand planning on supporting especially small island developing states? Thank you.
Thank you. Well?
Yeah, great questions and some common themes. I'll start with Indigenous people. You'll notice that I used a turn of phrase there, kaitiakitanga, to reference what I believe is New Zealand's approach to environmental issues generally. That is not a new concept, but it's perhaps one that's new to governance and new to the way that we are approaching these environmental issues, that we have that guardianship role. Māori, of course, have acted in that way for a long time. And in fact, we have a process in New Zealand around treaty settlements. The Treaty of Waitangi is what underpins our relationship between the Crown and Māori. And over the years, we've undertaken a settlement process which has led to, in some cases, co-governance arrangements for key environmental assets. So there's already a foundation there to acknowledge that actually there's a partnership required for us to really deliver on some of our environmental goals. And what we're seeking really is an extension of that. Māori in the area where, for instance, there's oil and gas exploration have long campaigned for an end to permits being issued around oil and gas exploration because of the environmental impacts, not least to marine life. So very much I would say that in climate change and that challenge, it's a partnership, and there's been a long foundation for that. Around small island nations, I see New Zealand having two roles. One is to work alongside small island nations on adaptation. And I already spoke a little about the investment in around renewables and so on. We also contribute to disaster relief. But the second is the Pacific Island nations have their own voice, and it's a strong one, but we have a lot of international platforms as well. And I see our role as amplifying their voice, not speaking for them, but telling their stories alongside them. And there is a strength and a power to storytelling on climate change. You know, when you just hear that there are children in Samoa who wade through water to get to school, or that there are village leaders in Kiribati who can show you the sea level rises in their lifetime, then that's when people see, regardless of what they may say about the science, that it's real. And no one can tell that story like the Pacific can.
So my question is about those innovative enterprises that raise more and more, that help an ecological transition, and how those New Zealand plans supporting those enterprises who are innovative. I think about like Tesla and electric cars and everything, how those New Zealand plans on helping those enterprises.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I have a grandfather in Mount Maunganui who's very jealous of me right now.
It's the Florida of New Zealand.
Yes. Essentially, I myself, though, am an Australian, and yet whilst we think of ourselves as the big brother to our New Zealand cousin or younger brother, it is often many times that you do things first and you do things better. And regarding environmental migration, that seems to be the case. Or not in migration, sorry, environmental regulation. Do you see opportunities for collaboration with Australia in order to enhance what we're doing? Because I think we need to follow your model.
Very good point. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. It's an honour to
Can you go closer to the mic, please?
Is this better? I'm short, I'm sorry. It's an honour to hear your insights, and indeed I was wondering if you would be able to provide your insights on the compatibility between effective climate change and an agricultural sector such as we have in New Zealand, which is responsible for 50% of our gross emissions, but also a massive part of our GDP. Thank you.
Great. Excellent questions. On encouraging enterprise, that is, that's the next frontier. I'm really pleased that when you look at the global investment profile, I think last year was the first time where investment in renewable energy outstripped investment in oil and gas exploration and production. So that's the kind of tip in the scale and the balance that we need. In New Zealand, our belief is that we can encourage that even further. Part of our coalition agreement with the New Zealand Green Party was the establishment of a $100 million green infrastructure and investment fund, and we hope to leverage private investment through the use of that. So we are looking for ways to encourage that. Equally, we're also looking at a R&D tax credit, a research and development tax credit, and our hope is to encourage that private sector innovation in this area. In Australia, if we're the little brother, we're that kind of annoying, naggy, kind of overachieving little brother type, I hope. as the youngest sibling, I don't take offence to that reference at all. Is there room for collaboration? Always. There's room for collaboration with any like-minded country on these issues, just as I see room for collaboration, and indeed there is currently collaboration with France. Probably where it makes good sense for us to collaborate is for the work that we do in the Pacific, coordinating both that disaster release but also ODA into areas that actually the Pacific themselves are saying we're interested in moving towards renewable. They've got goals that are more ambitious than developed nations on renewables, and so there's a real area we can collaborate on the compatibility of agriculture and some of our goals. You know, this, as I said in the beginning, this is where we have a chance to really be world leaders. And I had a meeting with a group of New Zealand food producers not that long ago, and I asked them to describe what they saw as New Zealand's point of advantage, and they used, most commonly amongst all of them, 3 themes: trust in our products, quality, but also the environment. And so they saw that as being critical to our place in the world. And so for us, it's about building that partnership with our food producers to say, well, what can we do to enhance that? And that comes right down to making sure we're investing in the research and development that says actually there are certain types of cow feed that if you use, reduce your profile. And the more that we do that work, the more that we can empower our agricultural sector to make choices that really reduce our profile and enhance our brand. So I see them as working really well together.
Good morning, good afternoon, Mrs. Prime Minister. Thanks a lot for the conference, and sorry for my accent.
It's a beautiful accent.
Thank you very much. As you are Prime Minister, you must have done thousands of kilometers by plane in order to go abroad. So don't you think it is a stronger and harder challenge to fight for climate change, for strong policy against climate change in a country like New Zealand that is geographically isolated?
Yes, it's a good question. But of course, we also have a national carrier in Air New Zealand that's working towards carbon neutrality as well. So these are not mutually exclusive goals, they are challenges. But you know, there are some areas where reducing your profile is difficult, but offsetting is not. And so encouraging that option as well, I think is absolutely legitimate, as long as it's not in lieu of also reducing down your emissions profile overall. So there are some examples there. I was recently told that our ministers' travel miles were offset. I'd have to go back and check that that's the case. But we are trying to be exemplars by moving our Crown fleet towards EVs by 2025 as well. So we've got goals that we're trying to put in place to make sure that we walk the talk, because that's a good question. Sorry, I forgot to get the extras.
I can tell anyway that your action into Pacific Islands, you have sort of students there upstairs, so we should not abandon them.
Yeah, thank you so much. I thought maybe we had forgotten about up here. First, as a young woman, I want to thank you so much for coming. I know I speak for probably a lot of the women in this room. You really are such an inspiration for all of us. And maybe you've noticed, but Sciences Po is really a female majority school with the proportion. So I think it really means a lot to everybody. So maybe if you've noticed by my accent, I'm American. I come from, maybe if Australia is the big brother, then we're probably the hideous. I'm joking. But my question sort of relates to what types of approaches do you have to take with leaders that might not necessarily share similar views with you on these types of scientifically based issues across our globe? Like my president, Donald Trump. Do you have any strategies that you're envisioning for the future during your presidency? Thank you.
Maybe you can take one or two more questions. Jacinda. Yes?
Hello. Harimai, Tanako, and all the best for the next few months. So you mentioned before that in New Zealand we're in a unique position, and I think this is especially poignant. My question is, in that unique position, it may be easier for us to lead the direction on climate change. how do we lobby to the international world to take the New Zealand direction further?
Thank you, and maybe you.
Hello, Prime Minister. I'd like to ask you whether you share my Prime Minister, Theresa May's vision of a post-Brexit 21st century Commonwealth.
I think it's a very good program for next week, not this week.
I'll take these. There was real similarity in those questions. Basically, how do we spread action or ensure a global action on climate change? And over the course of the years that I'm in this position, I'm sure I will see the support for action on climate change wax and wane in different quarters. All I know is that we have to be consistent ourselves and demonstrate what's possible and why it's important. On the what's possible, it's pretty hard to get a profile that is quite as challenging, I would say, as ours. Look on the energy generation side, on electricity generation. Actually, we're pretty good. We've got 85% renewable electricity generation as it is, so we're on track there. Transport, we've got some challenges. We don't naturally have an inclination to use public transport. That's because we never built it particularly well in New Zealand, but there's opportunity there. But when roughly 50% of your emissions are coming from animals, that's hard. Now, if we can demonstrate what's possible with a profile like that, then I think we start to remove some of the hurdles and the barriers that others might see. Because I think what we're seeing from other global leaders is simply a reaction to their domestic population and domestic challenges. And we all have those. We all have to meet the needs and demands of people to say, we need financial security, we need job security, we need to know that you have our best interests at heart. We can pursue an agenda around climate change and provide for our domestic population. And that's why things like just transitions, planning for our future workforce, is so important to New Zealand. And so I'm hoping we can model what's possible, how you can care and support for your domestic voters and population whilst trying to achieve some of these big goals.
Maybe we can take the
post-Brexit Commonwealth. Look, I think generally we have to demonstrate the importance and the value of working collaboratively in a world where there seems to be additional moves to protectionism, to isolating ourselves, to a unilateral approach. We need to really build those coalitions again. That's really important. I see the Commonwealth, regardless of the origin of that grouping, as relevant as any other of those international fora for us to demonstrate a collective approach to some of the globe's challenges.
So let's take the three last questions. If we stop there.
Should we just do four? We'll just rattle them all off.
Four. And then I know you have a busy schedule, Prime Minister, so just come on.
Hi, so this has been covered a bit already, but I research specifically about climate change and adaptation and displacement. So my question is about the Migration with Dignity program that you have. So it relates to small islands, but a bit more specific. And as you said, most people really want to stay where they are if possible. So I'm just curious what sort of reception you've had from the states you're working with, of the small island states, about this program, what you see for the implications of the program moving forward, and how you see it could be applied, or you could find assistance from other states that might be able to lend a helping hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Go on.
Kia ora, Prime Minister.
Good work. Kia ora.
Thank you. Just a few months ago, a French TV investigation, cash investigation, shows that the river in New Zealand are really pulled by agriculture, and what New Zealand done is just changed the RAT and to present a good result of pollution of river. So what do you think about this?
I think this person is asking
the Māori part I got
Yeah,
absolutely.
But he was asking that on the pollution of the rivers, if I got it right, the administration, I don't know exactly, changed the way to measure pollution, so has to offer better sort of performance, if I got you right.
That's it.
Okay, thank you. Just...
Hi, Prime Minister. Shahen from the Lebanese American University in Beirut, Lebanon. Such an honor to have you here. My question is about climate refugees. Climate refugees are not really categorized as refugees according to the United Nations, and the previous Prime Ministry has not really done anything about this. And according to a CNN interview you did in October, November, you said that you may have to take climate refugees in sooner or later. And how is this going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question. And then the last one.
Dear Prime Minister, Donald Trump has recently expressed is willing to finally join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If it is really the case, what will be the position of New Zealand about that? And will you have some environmental conditions for him to join? Thank you.
All very good questions. On the issue of climate refugees, I mean, there have been cases where individuals have sought that status and that has been declined, and so it's encouraged a conversation and debate regionally around this issue. And what we've said is that we already have a number of really Pacific-specific immigration visas and programs. So we have a seasonal workers visa program. We have a particular regime already specific to Samoa. So there's already some infrastructure there. The question we're asking ourselves is, can we utilise some of those existing programs to also factor in people's individual climate refugee status, perhaps? So there is still quite a bit of work to be done in that space. It's very, very early days in that conversation. But I think the point that I made, or was trying to make, was in the context of that, we do have to remember that that mitigation is still key, and that that these nations, of course, want to fight to save their own homes, and how frustrating it must be to know that that is at the whim of others, because they could entirely do their bit and still face the tragic consequences of others not pulling their weight. In terms of their response, certainly the climate refugee question has been raised from within the Pacific. It's something we're really responding to as opposed to the other way around. But at the same time, they would raise readily issues of mitigation. On the issue of the TPP, we've had a couple of times now the suggestion that the United States might be interested in joining what is now the CPTPP. You'll have to ask Prime Minister Trudeau why that name was adopted, because I'm sure we could have come up with something a little snappier. Our response to that question really has been, well, actually there's a number of nations that have expressed a potential interest to join the CPTPP, and that if that were to be the case, that would re-trigger talks. There is no automatic re-entry. Over 20 provisions have been suspended since the time of the US withdrawal, so it would mean that would really start a conversation renewed. When it comes to trade generally, though, the CPTPP, or the TPP as it was known, was hotly debated in New Zealand. And it really raised for us this issue of building a social license around trade agendas. The public want to know how trade benefits them, in the same way that they've probably been asking the question in some countries as to how globalisation has benefited them. And I think we've seen the consequences of not having faced up to that sense of financial insecurity that people over the years have started to feel as a consequence of these changing structures and norms. Now, my view is politicians can either respond in one or two ways. They can respond with fear, or they can respond with hope. They can give the sense that these things can be rolled back and we can try and protect against the inevitable, or you can acknowledge the reality and say, actually, we have tools and power in government to make sure that the benefits of these changes are reaped and felt more broadly. And that includes for trade. So last week, we've kicked off an agenda in New Zealand around trade for all, which is focused on how we can use trade agreements to uphold environmental standards, labour protection standards, so we can focus more on benefits for Indigenous New Zealanders, women, small business, so that we can rebuild the social licence for trade. And so it's my hope that we'll start to model some of this in, for instance, a potential future EU FTA between New Zealand and the EU.
Prime Minister, you are touching a very, very important point on how we govern globalization in the next 10 or 15 years if you don't want to have all peoples revolting against what is happening to them. And I think we don't have that discussion globally for the moment. So everyone is facing the problem at home, but there is not a big discussion, and I'm sure that President Macron will mention that to Prime Minister Trudeau. Well, they had lunchtime, I think. They have already done that. But I think you could, as you have been key instrumental in launching this carbon neutrality discussion, I think it would be really welcome. And I'm sure all my students would really, and we are discussing that all the time in the class, and I'm sure all the professors here, to launch that global discussion we need, which is not, and coming from a nation who was so free trade, nobody can think that New Zealand is a protectionist country, but to say, let's face the problems and let's find the solution to get a more cooperative future. I think you would. Islands can do a lot.
Well, indeed, and
so you could do that.
This first challenge started, obviously, globalization, the global financial crisis, and the next leg, I think, will be rapid technological change, which challenges the very nature of work as we know it, and job security. You know, in New Zealand alone, 46% of the jobs that we have now over the next 2 decades will either disappear or change entirely. This will be the next form of insecurity for our population. And we're trying again to get ahead of that ball by saying, well, we're not going to just let it happen. We can't predict where the future economy and where future employment opportunities will exist, but we can lay the groundwork for an adaptable workforce and one we've invested in, which is why in the first 100 days we came into office, we made the first year of post-secondary education for any worker, for any New Zealander, anyone who had never accessed education after high school, to go back into polytech, to night school, to apprenticeships, to retrain and invest in themselves, because preparing our workforce will be the way that we prepare for that next wave of disruption. So we need to get ahead of it. Otherwise, we'll continue to see that unsettled uncertainty amongst our populations, and we will reap the political consequences of it.
And we have to combine trade and peace where connected. So we have to protect a certain type of trade if we want to maintain peace. And when you look at the global situation, Prime Minister, I have experienced that in the multilateral system, small countries can do sometimes much more than the big elephants. It's not only the rule of the big elephant. So I'm sure all of us, we trust you that you will bring this new voice in this big problem we are facing with geopolitics, war, but at the same time, a great push to more cooperative action. So a big, big round of applause to the leadership.
Thank you.
Standing ovation.
Thank you very much. Yes.